Joining us now, NBC News Justice and Intelligence correspondent Ken Dilanian, Atlantic staff writer Ashley Parker, and former U.S. Attorney Barbara McQuade. Ken, on this federal buyout offer, could the judge block them permanently today? And what happens to those folks who already took the offer?
That's a great question, Anna. Could the judge block this permanently? Well, nothing is permanent in terms of a district judge because, of course, the Trump administration likely would appeal that ruling to a higher court. But absolutely, the judge could block this today. And if he does, that really does leave these 60,000 or so people who signed up for this buyout in limbo and arguably puts a target on their back because they've communicated to the Trump administration they no longer want to work in government. The issue here, the legal issue here, is a question of, does this amount to the government spending money without congressional appropriation? Because they're offering essentially 8 months of pay without work to a whole group of federal employees. And by the way, the number of takers has been much lower than the 5 to 10% of the workforce that they were hoping for, in part because a lot of people have said, look, there are no guarantees under this. And when you sign up for it, you also agree not to sue the Trump administration to enforce it. So there's a lot of questions surrounding this, and perhaps the federal judge today will answer some of them, but it won't be the last word on it.
And Barbara, I read part of that J.D. Vance tweet or post, if you will, earlier, saying judges aren't allowed to control the executive's legitimate power. Here he was in 2021 with what he called advice for President Trump.
Fire every single mid-level bureaucrat, every civil servant in the administrative state, replace them with our people. And when the courts, because you will get taken to court, and then when the courts stop you, stand before the country like Andrew Jackson did and say the Chief Justice has made his ruling, now let him enforce it.
Barbara, the administration has been blocked or slowed down on slashing the federal workforce, on accessing the Treasury payment system, also birthright citizenship, also some anti-trans efforts. Can they just defy the courts, as the vice president seems to be suggesting there, especially if Congress doesn't step in?
It would be an absolute violation of the Constitution, as J.D. Vance well knows. Since the case of Marbury versus Madison and the founding era of our country, it has been the role of courts to interpret the law. A president can do many, many things and has great powers, but a president cannot violate statutes or the Constitution. And so that's what these lawsuits are arguing. It isn't so much what Donald Trump wants to do, but how he is doing it in violation of constitutional rights and federal statutes. And that's where this comment becomes so concerning, because what J.D. Vance said in that clip is that if the courts stop Donald Trump, well, what are you going to do about it if we just do it anyway? Of course, the answer is that a president who acts in violation of the law is subject to impeachment. But that relies on a Congress that is willing to hold him accountable and to do their duty in that part of the separation of powers.
Ashley, you covered President Trump in his first term. How much of a change is this when it comes to his attitude towards the courts? Do you see the, potential defiance here as a result of the legal battles that he's waged over the last few years out of office?
It's a tremendous change, in part because when you talk to people close to Trump who work for him, they say that this time he is coming back more confident, more comfortable in his own skin is a very specific phrase I've heard a few times, more emboldened. He knows what he wants to do, and he's willing to push the boundaries of what Congress is willing to do to stop him, what the courts are willing and able to do to stop him. And in those comments you played from both the president and his vice president, you sort of see them. And Trump is as much a master of messaging, certainly, as he is of actual policy. But you see them laying the public groundwork, at least, to try to do what they are very clearly signaling they're going to do. That if they don't like a court decision, they will potentially just ignore it. The last thing on the courts, of course, is as things get appealed, not all of them, but a number of them potentially can go up to the Supreme Court, where in his first term, Trump played a very active role in remaking that court, appointing 3 conservative justices to it, referring to them as my justices. And he very much believes, even though it's not always borne out, that they will rule not the way a Supreme Court should, but in favor of what he wants politically.
Ken, the Justice Department's also fired a number of federal prosecutors involved in prosecuting President Trump before he was reelected. Also, several top FBI officials have been booted. Do we expect legal challenges there?
I'm glad you raised that, Anna, because it's almost like we've forgotten about this. This was a huge deal, that the firing of prosecutors simply because they worked on cases that the president didn't like. And we haven't seen any legal challenges yet. A number of them just decided to retire because they were eligible for retirement, both FBI agents and prosecutors. But we do expect legal challenges. Many of them have hired lawyers. And most legal experts who look at this say that they will win. They were fired illegally. They're civil servants. They had a right to due process, and they weren't granted that due process. Will that bring back their careers? No, it will not. They're gone from these places. They've lost their clearances. They're away. But they may end up getting back pay and their reputations partially restored. But that will be a long time from now. Unfortunately, the Trump administration knows that even when people win and get remedies, it takes a while to go through the process on it.
Ashley, got to ask you about this scoop you have about President Trump purging some members of the Kennedy Center board and making himself the chair. What is that all about?
So this is something we broke last week, right before, a couple hours before the president truthed it. I see you have that truth up there. But that's about the first time Donald Trump, his first term, he came to Washington, sort of the artists and, culture, with a capital C culture, embarrassed him. They threatened to boycott the Kennedy Center honor some of them if he came. Others said they would go and be honored, but they would not go to the White House for the reception that goes along with it, that traditional reception. There was a presidential arts board, Arts and Humanities, where all of the members resigned in the wake of his comments after what happened in Charlottesville. And this time, as it was explained to us, he made a decision that basically said, to heck with it. I'm not going to stay away from the Kennedy Center just because these artists don't like me. And in fact, I'm going to very visibly remake it in my image. So that meant purging these board members. It's a bipartisan board. So some of them were appointed most recently by President Biden, purging those people who were clear Democrats, Biden allies, restoring himself or appointing himself as the chair. And one thing he did cite in that truth post is he said, look, the Kennedy Center put on a drag show performance. That's not what, in line with our Make America Great vision. And so this is another way he is looking for, as his aides have told me, ways to really push his anti-DEI and woke messaging across the government. And of course, culture and sort of, as he himself described it, a crown jewel of the nation that sits right in Washington, like the Kennedy Center, to use that to make such a public point is another part of making clear that he is acting on his agenda.